I mean, my guess is, for what it's worth, is that Trump's going to want to have something to say. The guy clearly likes, you just see with the whole kind of nonsense about Mexico, he likes to present something as a deal that he's won. So my best guess, which I have very little confidence in, is that some sort of headline deal will be announced as tentative and blah, blah, blah. But I think the dilemma that inadvertently Trump has created is a much deeper, unjustifiable, however, in my view, but a much deeper angst about China in the whole of the US. And now, maybe this is behind why he said what he said overnight. If he comes up with too easy a deal, he's now going to be accused of being soft about China. And I'm really bothered about that, because that means we could be set for years and years of reoccurring strategic dilemmas across the piece about China in the US. And I think it's kind of nuts. I don't think the US is being in the slightest bit logical.
But Jim, what is this about, right? Is this a fight of supremacy in the next 10 years, or is this actually got traits? When the president says,
I think it's the first thing. I think originally there was some, bits of it reminded me of the whole game with Japan 30 years ago and the events surrounding the so-called Plaza Accord with the dollar and all the rest of it. And this sort of reoccurring every other decade thing to pick on some country, to basically blame all the US.
They're picking on a big country.
But in this case, they're picking on a really big country. But more importantly, it's now morphed into this thing where the US appears to have, I guess, emotionally understandable, but any other reason completely lacking in logic, fear about China becoming bigger than the US. So it's almost like they're now going to do whatever they can to stop China becoming bigger than the US. But I'm not quite sure what the purpose of such a goal is, but it looks to me as though that's what it's becoming.
Okay, and what's the impact on the economy? Is this the psychology of chief executives or even consumers not investing or not spending because they worry?
So I probably have a slightly unconventional view about this. I think it's much more concerning than that. If you look at it from 40,000 feet, the past decade, the US has kind of made some structural recovery post-crisis, particularly as evidenced with the current account deficit, dropping to 2.5% of GDP when it was above 6. And the US was consuming too much 10 years ago, and it was all borrowed from the rest of the world. Today, it's back to consuming over 70% of GDP again. So going forward the next decade and beyond, the US economy's future isn't about the US consumer. It's about investing more in real stuff and exporting more to the rest of the world. And if you're going to try and destroy the second biggest place in the world that's growing between 6 and 7%, it is extremely unhelpful to your own long-term interests. So it's not very logical, and I find a lot of people just sort of take it for granted. Because the US cycle is strong, that means structurally the US is strong, but I don't think it's in the slightest bit true. And it looks to me the bond market's realised it.
Are you looking at a recession in the US? And when you look at the bond market, so the inverted yield curve, which I keep on being told this time it's different because of central bank policy action, you think actually it's indicating an impending slowdown or recession?
So, as you'll perhaps recall, going back to my Goldman days, I'm a big fan of something that you would call a financial conditions indicator as a leading indicator. In fact, with Bill Dudley when he was at Goldman, we kind of created them. And they're really powerful for the US, but I wouldn't dismiss the power of the yield curve. I think it's important information. And what I fear is the US has the cycle has become really asymmetric relative to financial conditions. So a relatively modest tightening of financial conditions, which can happen through higher bond yields or lower stock prices or a combination of them both. When that happens, the US economy seems to slow quite quickly, and yet when financial conditions ease, the supportive response of the economy isn't that big. And that suggests to me an economy that's sort of slightly addicted again to extremely favourable financial conditions, which makes them very vulnerable to adverse shocks. And so I think the common view at the moment that the US is relatively immune and can beat the hell up on China and Mexico or whoever, I think it's basically mistaken.
But would the president or the Trump administration or whoever comes next, as soon as they see that, actually pull back, and will it be too late? Like, is a recession in the U.S. in the next 18 months now a given, or can they back China?
I don't think it's quite given, but we're getting closer to it in my view. But, again, if you put it in sort of 40,000 feet context and my own experience of looking at the US and markets, the US does tend to lurch quite dramatically. And this approach at the moment is all against the background of this strong self-belief that the US is strong and the dollars, can never be challenged, etc., etc. But once that starts to become challenged by evidence, and if the economy does go into recession or gets closer to it, I wouldn't be surprised if you saw a radical move. Quite how Trump would do that, I have no idea. But obviously, for himself, the economy's stupid. You would imagine as you get close to the election, it's not going to be very helpful to him either. So hence bringing it all back, why I think he'd want to do a deal. But he's unleashed a whole set of forces of paranoia about China that I'm pretty sure he certainly didn't strategically intend. And I'm not quite sure how you put that back to bed.
A promise to take Britain out of the EU on October 31st, whatever happens. But the opposition Labour Party is also launching another attempt at blocking a no-deal Brexit, starting with a vote this afternoon to seize control of the parliamentary agenda. Well, Home Secretary Sajid Javid, also launching his campaign today, will argue that Johnson is the wrong choice. Jim, I'm not sure how we should take it. If you're an investor and you look at this, you got to think, okay, there are 10 candidates. It's more likely that it's probably a pro-Brexit. Does it mean that there's a bigger chance of a no deal, this year than it was 2 months ago?
I'm not sure. I mean, as you've just touched on, probably more importantly than the launch of Boris's formal campaign today is this discussion going on in the Commons about legislation to stop no Brexit, which importantly is going to be backed by a couple of Tory prominent MPs, Oliver Letwin notably. So I'm not sure whether it's Boris or anybody else, how they deal with that. And I find my mind, partly because of Boris's personality, if you make the probably or possibly questionable assumption he's the guy.
Questionable, or you think that's like an 80% done deal?
I don't think. There is this fact that for the past 50 years, the favourites never won a Tory leadership campaign. So
but his name's recognisable.
I mean, it's his to lose. It is his to lose. But Boris is Boris, and something may appear or happen where it suddenly becomes impossible for him to be the guy. But if we make the assumption he is, or for that matter, if it's anybody else, I'm not sure how you deal with that. It's easy to play to the very small, unrepresentative sample of very old Tory voters who will determine their leadership. But that isn't representative of Parliament or probably the country. And the new Prime Minister is going to have to deal with that. Now, if it's Boris, because I subscribe to this view, he doesn't really have deep philosophy about Brexit, I find myself wondering whether it actually might slightly increase the probability of a second referendum. Because if he can't get it through, he's going to obviously campaign on this. I'm tough Boris, I led the whole Brexit thing, we're out. But if he then faces reality that he can't do, and the choice is, well, vote of confidence or second referendum. And the last thing a Boris, who's craved being leader of the country for so long, is going to do, I think, is risk an election, because he might end up only being Prime Minister for 3 months. So by default, it's like, well, okay, why don't we have another referendum, no deal, or we don't leave?
What's the question on the referendum? Because if you have a referendum, it's unclear exactly. I mean, if you look at the latest polls, actually, it still give it to Brexit, but then we're back to square one if we have the same composition of Parliament. So, what kind of Brexit?
I mean, I've never been a big fan of a second referendum until we've kind of got to this stage. But if you're still stuck in this core impasse between our MPs and Parliament, which at the end of the day, it was all supposed to be our sovereignty coming back, and they won't support a hard Brexit, then I think there is some genuine case to go back to the population and say, actually, is what you really would be happy to see is just a clean, straight break?
But what do you ask? So, are you for a no-deal Brexit?
Are you for a Brexit, which just means get out and ignore the consequences till afterwards? Or would you, in hindsight, rather stay? And maybe you could throw in, as a third part of it, maybe actually Theresa May's deal.
And what do you think, which way do you think it will go?
I think if you had the three options, we wouldn't leave. And I find myself thinking there is probably a stronger probability, at least for the next 2 or 3 years, that we won't leave than a hard Brexit. Okay. I mean, it's easy to make all this bravado stuff about a hard Brexit, but I just don't see how it's going to happen.